NASCAR never feared loud engines, because loud engines were easy to understand. Noise could be measured, controlled, and regulated. Horsepower that announced itself with violence fit neatly inside the sport's mental framework. What NASCAR never learned how to handle were engines that behaved normally while doing something abnormal. Machines that followed every written rule, yet refused to perform the way the rulebook said they should. Those engines didn't look dangerous. They didn't sound rebellious. And that is exactly why they were feared. In 1967, Smokey Yunick arrived with one of those engines. The car was a Chevelle, and on paper, it was unremarkable. Its displacement was legal. Its carburation passed inspection. Compression ratios sat comfortably within limits. Nothing about it suggested a challenge to authority, and nothing about it hinted at the kind of disruption it was about to cause. But the moment the green flag dropped, the illusion collapsed. The Chevelle didn't leap forward with brute force or dominate with spectacle. Instead, it pulled earlier than expected, deeper into the lap, and without the fall-off, every other engine suffered. Drivers felt it immediately, not as a surge, but as a calm, relentless pressure that made them question their own gauges, their own instincts, and eventually their own equipment. Officials noticed just as quickly, the engine didn't behave like a big motor chasing peak horsepower, and that made it unsettling. Torque arrived where the rules said it shouldn't. Power stayed available when it was supposed to fade. Lap after lap, the Chevelle ran with a kind of mechanical confidence that exposed a flaw in NASCAR's thinking. This wasn't domination by excess. It was domination by control. Rival teams didn't accuse Smokey Yunick of cheating at first. They accused NASCAR of letting something slip through because the performance didn't match the numbers they all believed defined speed. Inspections followed, and they only made the situation worse. Bore and stroke were measured repeatedly. Carburetors were examined, removed, reinstalled, and checked again. Compression ratios were verified down to the smallest tolerances. Every inspection ended the same way. The engine was legal. And with each confirmation, the fear inside NASCAR grew. If the advantage wasn't hiding in displacement, fuel, or compression, then it was coming from something far more dangerous understanding. From airflow that couldn't be seen without cutting metal. From valve events timed for consistency instead of spectacle. From an engine designed to win races, not arguments. Smokey Yunick stood in the garage listening to the complaints, arms crossed, calm and unmoved. He had heard this tone before, the sound of people who knew something was wrong, but couldn't explain why. He hadn't built the Chevelle engine to shock fans or dominate dyno charts. He built it to expose assumptions. NASCAR believed power was something you chased at the top of the RPM range. Smokey understood races were won in the middle, where torque delivery, heat management, and stability decided who survived long runs. The rulebook limited numbers, but it said nothing meaningful about behavior. That silence was his advantage. As the season progressed, the Chevelle kept running, kept pulling, and kept embarrassing teams with bigger budgets and louder engines. Every lap it completed wasn't just a lap gained on the field. It was another moment NASCAR had to confront the uncomfortable truth that their rules governed appearance, not outcomes. This wasn't an outlaw engine in the traditional sense. There were no forbidden parts, no obvious violations, no smoking gun. The engine lived entirely in the space between what the rules described and what they failed to imagine, and that made it impossible to stop without admitting the system itself was flawed. By the time NASCAR understood what Smokey Yunick had built, the conversation had shifted from "what is he doing" to "why can't we stop him?" Because stopping this engine wouldn't mean banning a part or rewriting a paragraph. It would mean admitting that intelligence had outpaced authority, that compliance and domination were no longer opposites, and that one man had beaten the sport without ever breaking a rule. This is the story of Smokey Yunick's outlawed Chevelle engine that NASCAR couldn't stop. Smokey Yunick rolled the Chevelle onto the grid in 1967 knowing it would not survive the season. Not because it was fragile, but because it was too dangerous to be allowed to live. Under the hood sat an engine Nascar could hear, measure, and fear, even if they didn't yet understand it. This wasn't horsepower chasing trophies. This was engineering challenging authority. The first time the engine fired in public, heads turned for the wrong reasons. It didn't sound wild. It sounded controlled, smooth, almost restrained. But when the green flag dropped, the Chevelle pulled in a way that made veteran drivers glance at their gauges, convinced something was wrong with their own cars. Acceleration came earlier. Torque arrived deeper in the corner, and the power didn't fade when it was supposed to. NASCAR officials noticed immediately. Engines like this weren't supposed to exist. Not legally, not inside a rulebook written to cap displacement, airflow, and RPM. The Chevelle wasn't loud rebellion. It was quiet dominance, and that frightened them more. The complaints came fast. Rival teams didn't accuse Smokey of cheating. They accused NASCAR of letting him get away with something. Fuel curves didn't match expectations. Straightaway speeds made no sense relative to published specs. And the engine didn't behave like a big motor chasing peak horsepower. It behaved like a weapon built for endurance and inevitability. Smokey Yunick stood in the garage, arms crossed, listening. He had heard this tone before. The tone people use when they know something is wrong, but can't explain why. That engine was not built to shock fans. It was built to expose assumptions about cubic inches, airflow limits, and how much intelligence the rulebook assumed a mechanic possessed. NASCAR's first inspections found nothing illegal. Bore and stroke measured out within limits. Carburation passed visual checks. Compression ratios stayed where the rules demanded. Every number lined up just enough to keep the car legal and just far enough apart to make the results uncomfortable. That's when the fear set in. Because if the numbers were legal, then the advantage wasn't coming from size. It was coming from understanding, from how the engine breathed, how it filled cylinders, how torque was shaped instead of chased. Smokey wasn't building engines to win dyno charts. He was building engines to win races without looking impressive, and that made it harder to stop. The Chevelle kept running, kept pulling, kept embarrassing teams with bigger budgets and louder motors. Every lap it completed wasn't just a lap gained on the field. It was another minute NASCAR leadership had to explain why the rules weren't working the way they were supposed to. This wasn't an outlaw motor in the traditional sense. There were no obvious violations, no forbidden parts, no smoking gun. The engine lived entirely in the gray space between what the rules described and what they failed to imagine. Smokey had built engines like this before, but 1967 was different. This time, the platform was perfect. The Chevelle's weight balance, its chassis stiffness, its ability to put power down without drama. Everything worked together. The engine wasn't fighting the car. It was commanding it. Drivers who faced it didn't describe being beaten. They described being managed. Like the race was happening on Smokey's schedule, not theirs. They would push early, only to realize the Chevelle hadn't even started working yet. When it did, it was already too late. Inside NASCAR, the conversation shifted from "what is he doing" to "why can't we stop it?" Because stopping Smokey didn't just mean banning a part. It meant admitting that their limits were theoretical, not practical. That their rules controlled appearance, not behavior. And the more they watched the Chevelle run, the clearer it became that this engine wasn't an accident. It wasn't clever tuning. It was the product of a mind that treated NASCAR's rulebook like a challenge, not a boundary. Smokey Yunick had built an engine that didn't overpower the field. It outlasted it, outthought it, outraced it in ways that couldn't be protested without rewriting the sport itself. By the time NASCAR realized that this engine could not be regulated with existing rules, the damage was already done. The Chevelle had shown what was possible when intelligence was allowed to operate unchecked. And once again, Smokey Yunick had forced NASCAR into a corner it hated most, the one where the only way out was to admit they didn't understand the machines they governed. The engine was running. The Chevelle was legal, and the panic had just begun. Smokey Yunick did not build the Chevelle engine to impress dyno rooms or magazine editors. He built it in the quiet hours, in a shop where numbers were scribbled in pencil and erased just as often. This engine wasn't born from excess. It was born from restraint, from a man who understood that the most dangerous machines rarely announce themselves. By 1967, Smokey had already learned the lesson Nascar didn't want to hear. Peak horsepower was a distraction. It looked good on paper. It sold stories. But races weren't won at Redline. They were won in the middle, where throttle control, airflow efficiency, and torque delivery decided who survived long runs. That's where he aimed. The rules limited displacement, carburation, and compression. They said nothing meaningful about how an engine filled its cylinders. Smokey focused on airflow velocity instead of volume. Port shapes were altered in ways inspectors couldn't measure without cutting metal. Valve events were timed not for peak output, but for consistency under load. The engine breathed easier, longer, and with less stress than anything it lined up against. It shouldn't have worked, at least not the way it did. Longer torque curves usually meant sacrificing top-end speed. Conservative cam profiles were supposed to neuter aggression, but Smokey understood something most engine builders ignored. Engines don't race in isolation. They race as part of a system. Gearing, weight transfer, fuel delivery, and chassis balance all amplified what the engine gave them. The Chevelle became proof. Drivers noticed it first. The engine didn't surge. It didn't spike. It pulled. Lap after lap, the power stayed exactly where it was needed. No drama, no fall-off. Rivals pushed harder to keep up, overheating engines and burning tires, while Smokey's car stayed calm. That calm was intentional. Every component in the engine was selected for stability, not spectacle. Smokey believed heat was the enemy, not RPM. He managed temperatures aggressively, controlled combustion carefully, and refused to chase numbers that couldn't survive a full race distance. While other teams rebuilt engines between events, Smokey refined systems. NASCAR inspectors kept measuring what they understood: bore, stroke, carb size, compression. Everything came back legal. The more they measured, the worse it looked. Because the advantage wasn't hiding in a single number. It was hiding in how those numbers worked together. That engine scared people because it didn't act like a loophole. It acted like the future. Inside rival garages, mechanics began whispering that Smokey had found a way around displacement without increasing it, that he had built free cubic inches using airflow and timing instead of metal. Officially denied, privately discussed. No one could prove it. No one could copy it. Smokey never confirmed anything. He didn't need to. The track did the talking. The Chevelle didn't win by margins that caused protests. It won by inevitability, by turning every race into a test of endurance that only one engine could pass, and that was far more threatening than domination. Because domination could be regulated. Endurance exposed structural weakness. NASCAR leadership began to understand the danger. This wasn't a trick they could ban quietly. This was an approach, a philosophy. If other builders learned it, the rulebook would become irrelevant. Smokey had already crossed that line. He had built an engine that complied on paper and undermined authority in practice. An engine that proved NASCAR controlled dimensions, not outcomes. And once that realization took hold, the Chevelle engine stopped being a competitor. It became a problem NASCAR would not tolerate for long. NASCAR's response was slow at first, calculated. They couldn't accuse Smokey of cheating. Nothing on paper was wrong. Every bore measurement, every carburetor check, every compression test came back within the rules. And yet, on the track, the Chevelle was untouchable. Lap after lap, it ran with surgical precision, conserving tires, managing fuel, and extracting performance that should have been impossible. Officials called it a marvel. Rival teams called it a nightmare. The Chevelle didn't just win races, it humiliated the rulebook. Inside NASCAR headquarters, panic spread quietly. Engineers argued over whether the problem was in interpretation, enforcement, or outright sabotage. Letters were sent to crew chiefs, demanding explanation. Inspectors were ordered to watch every track session, take notes, measure everything they could. Smokey Yunick, as always, seemed unconcerned. He had already anticipated their next move. Every hidden feature in the engine, every subtle port shape, every cam profile tweak was designed to evade casual scrutiny and withstand meticulous measurement. The inspectors' frustration grew with each event. They measured valve lifts, intake volumes, and exhaust flow. They traced wiring, disassembled manifolds, and photographed every inch of the engine. And yet, every time they left, the Chevelle remained the fastest car on the track. They were chasing a ghost, an engine that obeyed the rules in form but defied them in function. To the outside world, NASCAR appeared competent. Behind closed doors, they were questioning their own competence. Rival teams grew desperate. Ford, Pontiac, and Chrysler crews dismantled engines, experimented with exotic alloys, and tried to replicate Smokey's work. Nights were spent poring over photos, scribbled notes, and spy reports. Mechanics staked out the Daytona Beach garage, hoping to glimpse the hidden innovation. Rumors spread of bribery attempts and covert intelligence gathering. Nothing worked. Smokey had designed an engine that functioned as a system, not a collection of parts. Even if someone copied the cam or the intake, the harmony would remain broken. On race day, the Chevelle was quiet, unassuming, almost polite. The engine hummed rather than roared, its rhythm controlled, predictable, and terrifyingly effective. As competitors pushed their cars harder, overheating, wearing tires, and exhausting themselves, Smokey's machine delivered every lap exactly as needed. Every gear change, every corner exit, every throttle application was a study in domination disguised as compliance. And in that disguise lay the horror. No inspector could point to a single violation. No competitor could accuse. The Chevelle's superiority was untouchable. Officials finally realized the truth. Smokey had done more than exploit a loophole. He had exploited assumptions. NASCAR assumed that peak numbers defined performance. They assumed that a legal engine would behave like all others. They assumed that compliance equaled predictability. Smokey proved each assumption false. Every measurement, every regulation, every threat to dismantle the engine was met with calm precision. He had built a machine that respected the written rules while completely ignoring their spirit. By mid-season, whispers turned into policy discussions. Senior officials debated rule changes, talking in hushed tones about the danger of a single builder undermining decades of precedent. Should they ban the Chevelle outright? Reinspect every engine before every race? Introduce new displacement checks? Every option seemed insufficient. Smokey's engine was legal, repeatable, and terrifyingly effective. Each proposal exposed the limits of NASCAR's control and revealed the organization's vulnerability. On the track, the Chevelle continued its quiet domination. It was not flashy. It did not scream for attention. But with every lap, it humiliated the sport's regulatory framework. Drivers raced not against horsepower alone, but against ingenuity that they could neither see nor touch. The Chevelle became more than a car. It became a symbol, a message, an unspoken reminder that intelligence could outpace rules, that clever engineering could expose authority as fragile and reactive. By the end of the chapter, it was clear. NASCAR had lost control, at least temporarily. The Chevelle engine didn't just win races, it rewrote the hierarchy of power. Officials were forced to watch, to measure, and to acknowledge that in the hands of a mind like Smokey Yunick, compliance and domination were no longer mutually exclusive. The Chevelle was a masterpiece of outlaw engineering, and the sport that thought it governed the track had been outclassed. By the final races of 1967, the Chevelle was no longer just a competitor. It was a threat to the entire NASCAR establishment. Officials were exhausted, frustrated, and humiliated in equal measure. Meetings behind closed doors grew heated. Engineers and inspectors argued over terminology, legal definitions, and hypothetical penalties. Some suggested disqualifying every Yunick entry retroactively. Others whispered about rewriting rules mid-season. Smokey Yunick didn't care. He watched the chaos with the faint, knowing smirk of a man who had already won. The Chevelle ran silently, methodically, lap after lap, leaving rivals scrambling and spectators in awe. Engines overheated chasing it, tires shredded, fuel strategies collapsed. Every victory reinforced the unspoken reality. The rules could be obeyed perfectly and still be defeated entirely. Competitors learned an uncomfortable truth. Brute force, money, and connections meant nothing when a mind like Smokey's dictated the race. Each inspection, each measurement, each calculation from NASCAR was absorbed, anticipated, and neutralized before it even mattered. The engine was untouchable, and with it, the Chevelle's reputation grew into legend. NASCAR's panic escalated. Letters were sent, inspections intensified, and new regulations were drafted in haste. They tried to close loopholes, but Smokey's genius was iterative, adaptive. Every change was met with a countermeasure: camshaft tweaks, intake reroutes, exhaust balancing, fuel metering, all invisible to the human eye, all legal. His Chevelle became a living blueprint of resistance. Officials realized that the sport itself could be undermined, that history could be rewritten, not with scandal but with engineering audacity. For the drivers, the experience was humbling and terrifying. Junior Johnson and other veterans reported that driving the Yunick Chevelle was like racing against a ghost, a machine that anticipated problems before they happened. They pushed harder, knowing they couldn't match raw talent or innovative brilliance. Every win was a dagger to the pride of seasoned teams who had long dominated the circuits. Smoke screens, misdirection, and secrecy became part of the legend. Yunick wasn't just building engines. He was building myths, layering fear, respect, and awe into every component. In garages across the Southeast, mechanics studied photographs, dismantled old engines, and attempted to replicate the Chevelle's hidden tricks. Few succeeded, and even those who came close admitted the magic lay not in the metal, but in the mind orchestrating it. Yunick's Chevelle proved that mastery of rules could be more devastating than mastery of horsepower. Authority could be respected, measured, and still outsmarted. The sport had faced its first true outlaw engineer. By the season's close, NASCAR was forced to react decisively. Rules were rewritten, inspection protocols tightened, and a cautious reverence for ingenuity settled among officials. Yet the Chevelle and the engine inside it remained untouchable. Its victories were not erased, its design never fully revealed, and its impact endured. Smokey Yunick had achieved more than a race win. He had demonstrated that brilliance could bend rules without breaking them, that one man's vision could destabilize an entire system. The Chevelle returned to Daytona one last time, quietly, almost ceremoniously. No fanfare, no banners, just a machine that had proven the sport could be beaten from within. NASCAR officials inspected it meticulously, taking notes, photographs, and measurements. They left baffled, frustrated, and, privately, respectful. Few realized at the time that history itself had been altered. What had begun as an outlaw engine had become a symbol of audacious thinking, of a single mind daring to challenge authority with intellect, subtlety, and ruthless efficiency. Smokey Yunick's 1967 Chevelle engine remains a ghost in NASCAR lore. Its innovations were never fully documented, its loopholes never entirely closed, and its victories never fully credited. Those close to the program later admitted that it was more than a machine, it was a statement, a reminder that rules, no matter how rigid, are only as strong as the minds enforcing them. And somewhere, in garages, dusty collections, and old blueprints, The spirit of that outlaw engine endures, haunting the sport it once shook to its core. By the end of the 1967 season, the Chevelle was no longer just a car NASCAR had to deal with. It was a problem they needed to erase. Not because it was illegal, but because it proved something the sport could not afford to admit publicly. Smokey Yunick had shown that the rulebook did not control outcomes, only appearances. That you could obey every written regulation and still build something that operated beyond the governing body's understanding. The Chevelle didn't break rules. It revealed their limits. NASCAR eventually did what institutions always do. When intelligence outpaces authority, they changed the environment. Rules were rewritten, interpretations tightened, gray areas were closed not with precision, but with force. The goal was no longer fairness, it was containment. Smokey's engine wasn't banned because it was dangerous to competitors. It was dangerous to the system. Allowing it to continue meant inviting others to think the same way, and if that happened, the sport would become impossible to police. So NASCAR adapted, not to innovation, but to the man behind it. What made the 1967 Chevelle truly unsettling was that it didn't dominate through spectacle. There were no massive margins that demanded protests, no single moment that forced an immediate crackdown. It won through inevitability, through consistency, efficiency, and an understanding of racing that went deeper than numbers on a page. That kind of advantage can't be argued away. It can only be silenced. Smokey Yunick never apologized, never explained, and never fully revealed what he had done. He didn't need to. The track had already delivered the verdict. His engine proved that power didn't come from excess, but from restraint. That intelligence, applied quietly and systematically, could bend an entire sport without ever raising suspicion. And once that truth was exposed, it couldn't be unseen. Today, the 1967 Chevelle engine exists mostly as a ghost. Its exact details were never documented. Its innovations were whispered about, argued over, and partially copied, but never fully understood. Yet its impact remains everywhere. Modern NASCAR engines are more tightly regulated, more aggressively inspected, and far more controlled not because of scandal, but because one man demonstrated what was possible when assumptions were challenged instead of accepted. Smokey Yunick didn't just build an outlaw engine, he forced NASCAR to grow up. He showed that governing bodies don't lose control when rules are broken, they lose control when rules are outgrown. And in 1967, for a brief and uncomfortable moment, one quiet Chevelle proved that intelligence could run free inside a system that believed it had already accounted for everything. That is why this engine matters. Not because it was fast, but because it couldn't be stopped. And that is the legacy of Smokey Yunick's outlawed Chevelle engine that NASCAR couldn't stop 1967. If you care about real racing history, real engineering, and the men who changed the sport by thinking differently, subscribe.